didn't begin with fire, sirens, or the flash of nuclear light, but with a world that believed it was still functioning. The Great War did not erupt out of nowhere. It was not a sudden madness, nor a single catastrophic decision made in a moment of panic. According to every surviving canonical record, terminal logs, government documents, corporate memoranda, military briefings, and personal testimony, the apocalypse was not an accident. It was a process driven by depletion, fear, political paralysis, and the quiet normalization of violence. It unfolded over decades. It was debated, budgeted, legislated, automated, and finally delegated to machines. By October 23, 2077, the world did not end because humanity failed to see what was coming. It ended because everyone saw it coming and continued anyway. In the decades preceding the Great War, the world outwardly resembled stability. Governments still operated. Corporations still reported profits. Citizens still worked, consumed, traveled, and obeyed. The architecture of modern civilization remained intact, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, the fundamental assumption that had sustained industrial society for centuries was collapsing. The assumption of endless energy. By the late 21st century, the planet's easily accessible fossil fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. Oil, coal, and natural gas, resources that had fueled transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and warfare, were no longer sufficient to meet global demand. This was not speculation. It was documented policy reality. Energy shortages became systemic rather than temporary. Rolling blackouts, fuel rationing, and transportation failures were no longer exceptional events. They were expected conditions of daily life. Governments did not publicly announce the scale of the crisis. Instead, they managed perception. Advertising intensified. Patriotic messaging increased. Corporations rebranded scarcity as sacrifice. Citizens were told shortages were temporary, manageable, and necessary for national security. But the records show something else. By the early 2060s, governments across the world knew the crisis was irreversible. The energy crisis did not begin with nuclear war. It began with arithmetic. Global consumption outpaced discovery. Extraction costs rose exponentially. Infrastructure decayed faster than it could be replaced. Nations dependent on imports became strategically vulnerable. Nations with reserves became targets. The European Commonwealth was among the first to fracture. Facing catastrophic fuel shortages, the nations of Europe attempted to consolidate resources through economic and political unification. This effort failed. Member states hoarded energy, sabotaged infrastructure, and ultimately turned on one another. This escalation culminated in what records refer to as the Euro-Middle Eastern War. Europe, desperate for oil, launched military campaigns into the Middle East, regions still possessing significant petroleum reserves. These were not limited engagements. They were prolonged, brutal conflicts marked by urban warfare, civilian casualties, and infrastructure annihilation. The war achieved nothing. Oil fields were destroyed faster than they could be secured. Transportation networks collapsed. Supply lines failed. European cities began to starve. By 2070, the European Commonwealth effectively ceased to function as a unified political entity. The collapse of Europe did not trigger reform, it triggered imitation. The Euro-Middle Eastern War marked the transition from economic competition to open global conflict. From that point forward, energy scarcity was no longer managed through diplomacy, it was enforced through force. Across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, regional wars erupted over fuel depots, refineries, pipelines, and shipping routes. These conflicts are collectively referred to as the resource wars. They were not ideological wars, they were survival wars. Nations that could project power seized what they could. Nations that could not collapsed or were absorbed. Neutrality became impossible. The United States at this stage remained relatively insulated. It still possessed domestic oil reserves. It had vast industrial capacity, and most importantly, it was the global leader in a new technological frontier: nuclear fusion. Fusion power was the last great hope of pre-war civilization. Unlike fission, fusion promised clean, virtually limitless energy. It did not require fossil fuels. It did not produce long-lived radioactive waste, and it could theoretically sustain industrial society indefinitely. The United States invested heavily. Corporations like General Atomics and West-Tec received massive federal contracts. Experimental reactors were deployed. Fusion-powered vehicles entered the consumer market. But fusion was not enough. The technology remained expensive, fragile, and unevenly distributed. Fusion cores could power a city block or a single military unit. They could not replace the entire global energy infrastructure fast enough to prevent collapse, and other nations noticed, most notably China. As Europe burned itself out, global attention shifted to the Pacific. China, like Europe, faced energy collapse. But unlike Europe, China identified a single external solution: Alaska. Alaska's oil reserves represented one of the last significant untapped fossil fuel sources on the planet. In 2066, Chinese forces invaded Alaska in a direct attempt to secure those reserves. The United States responded immediately. What followed was the Sino-American War, the defining military conflict of the pre-war era. This was not a symbolic war, it was total. The United States deployed conventional forces, naval blockades, and eventually advanced powered infantry units. China responded with sheer manpower, industrial scale, and espionage. For the first time, war was fought by machines as much as by soldiers. One of the most consequential developments of the Sino-American War was the deployment of power armor. The T-45 and later the T-51 transformed infantry combat. Soldiers became walking tanks, capable of withstanding small arms fire, carrying heavy weapons, and operating independently for extended periods. Power armor did not just change warfare, it changed society. Technology required massive industrial coordination. It accelerated automation. Factories were retrofitted for military production. Civilian manufacturing declined. Labor displacement skyrocketed. To compensate, the government turned to robotics. Automated systems replaced human workers in logistics, policing, and infrastructure maintenance. Robots patrolled the streets. Algorithms optimized supply distribution. Surveillance expanded. The justification was efficiency. The consequence was control. As war intensified abroad, conditions deteriorated at home. Rationing became mandatory. Fuel, food, and consumer goods were strictly controlled. Travel required authorization. Dissent was monitored. Civil unrest increased. Protests erupted over shortages, conscription, and corporate profiteering. Labor unions clashed with security forces. Strikes were suppressed under emergency powers. Propaganda filled the void. Citizens were told the sacrifices were temporary, that victory was near, that abundance would return once the enemy was defeated. But the war had no end. By the early 2070s, the United States was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to delay collapse. As democratic processes strained under emergency rule, corporations gained unprecedented influence. Companies like Vault-Tec, Robco, and West-Tec became extensions of state power. They received classified contracts. They operated beyond civilian oversight. Their research was shielded from public accountability. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Vault program. Officially, Vault-Tec was contracted to build nuclear shelters to preserve American citizens in the event of atomic war. In practice, the vaults served additional purposes, many of which were deliberately concealed. The government knew nuclear war was possible. It prepared accordingly. In 2072, the United States annexed Canada. This was not presented as conquest. It was framed as a necessary security measure to protect supply lines to Alaska and maintain continental stability. Canadian resistance was swift and brutally suppressed. Military occupation forces were deployed. Civilian protests were met with lethal force. Public executions were broadcast as deterrents. The annexation marked a turning point. It demonstrated that the United States was willing to abandon international norms entirely to secure resources. It also revealed how far it was willing to go to maintain the illusion of order. By 2077, the world existed in a state of permanent emergency. China had been pushed out of Alaska, but the war continued. Diplomatic channels were effectively closed. Both nations maintained nuclear arsenals on high alert. Early warning systems were automated. Response protocols were delegated to machines designed to act faster than humans could think. The logic was deterrence. The reality was fragility. A single false reading, a single misinterpreted signal. There would be no time for debate. On October 23, 2077, the final chain of events began. What exactly triggered the launch remains unknown. Missiles were detected. Alerts were issued. Defense systems activated. Retaliatory strikes were launched. In less than 2 hours, civilization ended. The world did not die screaming. It died following procedure. The Great War was not an accident. It was the logical conclusion of decades of policy decisions made in the name of stability, security, and survival. The bombs fell because the world had already accepted their necessity. And by the time anyone questioned that assumption, there was no one left to answer.